The Defect is definitely the character that got the biggest overhaul in the transition to Slay the Spire 2. Not just from its card pool, but also its visual design and general feel as a character. Unless you count the Watcher, I guess, because yeah. While the most visible changes were, obviously, the things added, I think the most crucial, yet overlooked, were the things that had to be removed, to make it feel like a complete character. And yes, the Defect uses its pronouns. Stop misgendering my gay little autistic robot. So that's what I'll be talking about today, which cards and why got removed. This is the third video of the series. You don't have to watch the parts in order, so in the case you didn't, let me just quickly recap the rules. We will be talking about every card that isn't in the Defect's card pool, in comparison to the first game. This includes event-only cards, and those that transition into colorless ones. Like always, these are just my own theories and guesses. So if you have any of your own, I would highly appreciate it if you left them in the comments below. Also, this game is still in early access and constantly evolving, so while some cards shown might get changed in the future, the general arguments given in this video should still hold up. So, without further ado, this is explaining every removed card from Slay the Spire 2, Part 3, The Defect. Recursion was a very interesting card. First of all, I feel like it literally lies to you. It says it channels the orb you just evoked. And surely this isn't just me, but I feel like this should mean that if you evoke a Dark Orb, it should channel a new, fresh Dark Orb. You know, I evoke a Dark Orb and channel a Dark Orb, not a copy of the old one, which, as you can see in the footage, is not true. But hey, to be fair, card games have a history of lying to you. That being said, I think the real reason it got removed is the new orb type, Glass. This card, if it was used on a glass orb, would summon a copy of the oldest glass you have, which means the orb is probably already dying out, so it would be a very anti-synergistic card. On top of that, this card was really only viable with Dark Orbs, which is a design I never really liked. Auto Shields is a weird card. It always felt rather unfun to play with, not having any synergies or cool interactions, in fact having a ton of anti-synergies. The line of text, if you have no block, at best makes you think for a second or two, and at worst causes the card to be incredibly frustrating to use, as a lot of random stuff can give you block. On top of that, I think this card will be very frustrating in multiplayer, since there is a lot of cards there that give block to other players, especially considering that you want to play those cards as soon as possible, so that the other players don't waste their energy on defensive cards. Blizzard got replaced with Hailstorm, which I think fits Frost Orbs way more. First of all, this power allows for more variety, letting you get the full benefit of it while having only one Frost Orb active, making the card good in more decks than just those that spam Frost like it's the day after tomorrow. Also, the inconsistent chip damage feels just thematically correct as a reward for using Frost, especially in comparison to dealing a huge amount of damage with only one card. Bullseye has a very complex history as a card. Lock-on as a debuff used to make orbs, lock on to the enemies, but it was terrible I think, so it got reworked to be a vulnerable debuff, but for your orbs. This always stuck out as a strange decision, because 1. It's crazy that the lock on debuff doesn't make your orbs lock on to the enemies, but also 2, because one of the characteristics of orbs is that they are unaffected by almost all modifiers. Vulnerable, weak, frail, all don't affect them in the slightest. You could also argue that it would be kinda hard to calculate it, with you not being able to know how much damage you're gonna deal at the end of turn. Unlike attacks, which you can just easily hover over the enemy with. Additionally, the temporary orb boost is now in the form of temporary focus, which is way more clean and easy to understand in my opinion. And now, I would like to welcome the first guest coming over to the channel to talk about 3 of the Defect's cards. Take it away, Riptide Lab.
Steam Barrier. Steam Barrier was a kind of funny card in Spire 1 in that it was a zero cost card that was kind of like anti-synergistic with the zero cost package. Like the more that you brought it back with hologram and all for one, the worse it got. And it's been replaced more or less by Boost Away, which is a much stronger card and much more synergistic card. I think more fun to play with. But in general, it's like an example of Defect's tools getting stronger, which the same can be said for Streamline. Streamline, if you were around in Jorb's chat, there was like a running meme about how some tier list put Streamline, I think at A+ tier, if I'm remembering correctly.
Streamline? Streamline is A-?
Obviously not a great card. The fact, like you can see what they were doing there. There was also like a block card that started at 4 cost and went down every time you played a power. So they had this idea that the zero cost package would be supported by these cards that you could turn into zero cost cards mid-combat through some effort. Turned out to be a lot of effort for Streamline. You either had to cycle through your deck 3 times and commit to paying 2 energy for a vanilla kind of strike plus. I mean, the rate was barely better than strike. And it's been replaced by Momentum Strike, which is kind of like straight up power creep, but maybe this is a card that needed it. And Adaptive Strike, which is a card that I think is like very surprisingly powerful. I remember the first time I read it, it was kind of like a head scratcher, like what is this card all about? Adaptive Strike, if you haven't gotten the chance to do it, can go nutty with enchantments because the copies also get the enchantments. And then the last card I want to talk about today is Melter. Melter, I think it's like there weren't a lot of enemies that shielded themselves in Spire 1. The density of those enemies is so much higher in Spire 2, and so Melter kind of was like a forgotten card in Spire 1, but I think could really shine in the sequel. But it's also like, if you imagine from a design perspective, like one of the first cards you would cut, because like it's not really synergizing with anything. It's just like a vanilla card on its own. You might as well play with a new design if you're going to play with one. It's not core to any archetypes or any overlapping synergy packages. But one of the main reasons I think it's good that it's not in the game is because of the co-op mode. A few years ago, I designed a card game, like physical card game prototype of a potion brewing game where you and your fellow wizards would be, you know, going through the forest, finding ingredients and sharing them with each other, with the idea that there was no ownership of anything. So you could pass cards to each other and they would enter the other person's deck. You could put ingredients into containers and pass them to each other. And this prototype was really fun, like for the first 5 or 10 minutes of every run when things were relatively simple. But what happened was that as you got more complex cards, as you were doing more actions per turn, it became a big headache And part of it was because you had like these branching decision trees based on like overlapping prerequisites. Like every turn it would be like, wait, don't play anything yet. I want to draw a card and see if I get this, or I'm going to play this thing to make you draw a card. Or you would ask who needs what ingredient, and you would have this whole like stand-up meeting to start the turn, which wasn't very fun. And you know, and eventually you got this like table-wide analysis paralysis. And I think what they're trying to do with multiplayer is really streamline it, not the card. That you can, you know, sometimes you have to cooperate. They want it to feel not fully, you know, multiplayer solitaire, but that mostly you can sling your cards. And if you have a card that doesn't exhaust and removes the enemy block, if that's in one of the player's decks, everything should be like, okay, do you have Melter? Can you draw Melter? Because the other people don't want to play any attacks before you play your Melter, because that's wasted damage. So I think this is like one of those things that like in practice would be not very fun. I imagine they had a number of these designs in playtest that they cut out. Silent, for example, does have Expose, which does this type of thing, but it does exhaust. So it's like once per combat at most, and it's free, so the silent player can just fling it out quickly, as opposed to Melter, which will stick around forever.
Ah, so true, bestie. The removal of Consume comes down to the near removal of cards that give you permanent focus for the Defect, with there now being only one rare card that does that, in an attempt to make its playstyle more active, which I think they largely succeeded in, since, like Riptide just said, a lot of its other tools got buffed in exchange. That being said, removing orb slots is still a very interesting effect, so I'm glad they kept in the game with Pull Cap. More on that card later. Dark orbs in general were kinda underpowered in the first game. Because of that, they now have way more cards that summon them, and also now the cards themselves are individually stronger. For example, Doom and Gloom got reworked into Null, trading the AoE damage for weak, which synergizes with the slow nature of Dark Orbs, making the card overall better in my opinion. Now, let's talk about my unironically new favorite event, the Trash Heap. It took me 3 videos and a deep examination of every card in the pool, but now I feel like I truly understand the brilliance of this event, which I know is kinda ironic after the last video where I made a sarcastic joke about this exact event, but just hear me out here. All of the cards that it gives you were not considered good by at least a part of the first game's player base. However, almost all of them are either good in the early game, but fall off heavily later, or are nearly useless by themselves, but allow for some absolutely degenerate stuff if you build with them in mind. I might be looking a bit too deep into this, but the event kinda feels like it's daring you to turn trash into treasure, setting you up perfectly to find uses in those cards, since they are forced into your deck very early on, which means cards like Rip and Tear are gonna, well, rip and tear through the early game, and cards like Dual Rip are gonna give you enough time to find uses and synergy with them. Now that I think about this also applies to the relics in this event. 3 of them want to be gotten very early on, and 2 of those also benefit from a lot of new things added to the game. Darkstone Peria benefits from courses in the game being overall more rewarding to take, and also with more of them being forced onto you. And Dreamcatcher from many relics that either reward you for resting, or the tent that lets you rest for free every campfire. And also the other 2, Handreel and debut are relics that aren't good in a vacuum necessarily, but absolutely excel in the underdogs, which is the only act that this event is in. Tanger is amazing against many of the enemies that gain block in this very defensive act, and the boot is not only good against said block, but also semi-counters weaken, which is a debuff that many of the enemies there apply, and also intangible, and also strength debuffs, which on top of that means that it's gonna be useful against every boss of the act, as all of them use at least one of those things. Every day I realize more and more how masterfully this game is designed, down to the last smallest little details, down to this little wacky event that most people would interpret just as a little corny, self-deprecating joke made by the devs.
Anyway, have you ever gone on a massive tangent?
Rebound is a worse headbutt, with nostalgia using the mechanic way better in my opinion. Rip and Tear does deal a lot of damage, but doesn't really scale with anything the Defect wants to do in the late game, unlike its other common attacks. Hello World cluttered your deck too much with boring and underwhelming cards, and Stack commits the sin of its effectiveness depending on when in the cycle you draw it, which is rather out of your control. Additionally, cards shouldn't reward you for having a bigger deck size, because there are already many inherent upside and downside of having certain deck sizes. And also because there are many things that can make your deck ridiculously large. And Mind Blast gets a pass, the card is specifically balanced around that. Also, it's a colorless card, which often have more wacky and gimmicky effects. A similar argument can be made about the card Aggregate, since it's also a card with the same problems, but kind of even worse, because at least with Stack, we could possibly bring it back with Hologram, unlike this card, with there not really being a consistent way to get it into your hand early on, especially with, spoilers I guess, Seek also getting removed from the Defects pool. Equilibrium was kinda busted, and also generally applicable. It had no real reason to be specifically in the Defects card pool, which is why I think it transitioned into a colorless card. Still, this card doesn't do anything that bad, especially in comparison to the other cards that were turned colorless. So, my theory is that Megacrit wanted every character from the first game to have one of their cards turned colorless. And this was the only Defect card that was really fit for the transition, as, looking at the list myself, there aren't any other good candidates to be honest. The problem in Force Field is that it fails in both of the roles it's supposed to fulfill. One of them is being in decks that have a lot of powers, protecting you for high block as you play them. It doesn't work in that said role because you need to play way too many powers for this card to be good. And even assuming you do, then at that point, you should probably be already getting more than enough block against almost all enemies. Another role it's supposed to fulfill is being in decks that redraw and replay zero cost cards many times, just as Riptide said, which it also fails at since those decks don't want to play many powers, if any at all actually. Hi, this is day 2 of recording because it is so hot over here. It's like 40 degrees outside right now, so my ass cannot focus for longer than like an hour or so. But speaking of heat sinks got replaced with Subroutine. Both cards grant you the opportunity to play more cards after playing powers. They're pretty much interchangeable. I don't think they should both exist in the same game, but individually I think they're both like fine. I think Subroutine is a little bit better of a design, as it creates less polarizing game states, since with heatsinks you're either having disgustingly good turns, when your deck has a lot of energy generation, or have pretty much no use for the extra draw, sometimes hurting you even, by forcing you to draw powers you can't play. While Sabrothine most often allows you to play one extra card to protect yourself or play another power, being more humble but consistent. Recycle is a card that I have a lot to say about. I've looked through many discussions of this card, including the post that I made myself, and from what I can tell, this is a card that is pretty hard to understand and use effectively, with some people disregarding the card and calling it straight up bad. However, after experimenting with the card, most people realize that it's kind of insanely busted, if you understand how to use it. Reducing the size of your deck while giving you extra energy, having nearly no downsides, and on top of that, also having the potential to high roll if you draw it on the same turn as an expensive card, are all really powerful traits that are all packed into one card. But with that being said, I feel like I must ask, is that necessarily a bad thing to have in the game? Striving for perfect balance, assuming it is even possible, is more often a hindrance than not. While yes, most things should be at a similar power level, there are many cases where purposeful imbalance is a good thing, with the best proof of that theory being Grand Finale. This card is terrible, and I think it should be terrible. It's a very gimmicky effect that is frustrating to play with so often, and also requires a ton of setup and luck. However, since the card is so bad, picking it up is never the optimal choice, but a challenge you willingly accept. This, first of all, makes you way more tolerant to all of the frustration that comes with a card that's more often than not just straight up unplayable. But more importantly, makes it so incredibly satisfying once you are finally able to win a run with it. On the other side of the spectrum, there are many cards that benefit from being better than others. Examples of such are cards that put you on a timer or use some kind of permanent resource, because a new player will be very scared of playing with them. Recycle, I think, is one of those cards. First of all, like I said, it's pretty hard to use, so it being really good rewards the player for experimenting with it. It's also a card that gives you a lot of ways to utilize it, not just while deck building, but also during combats, allowing for a ton of skill expression from the player's side.
Sometimes I'll exhaust something to get the energy to play Meteor Strike, or sometimes I'll exhaust Meteor Strike to get the energy to do other things.
On top of that, this is a support card. It will very rarely define an entire strategy, but can be an enabler for some, like Infinite for example. This also means that it can fit into most decks. Because of all that, I think that Recycle, being a bit overpowered, helps the card rather than hurting it, and removing it from the game is honestly a decision that I don't really agree with personally. With all that being said, it got replaced with Scavenge, and comparing the two cards feels like comparing Doom to Ultra Kill, with one of them being okay, it's more normal, easier to understand and get around. It's safe, it's gonna work out. But the other one, allowing you to do so much cool stuff that's, granted, very hard to do, forcing you to understand the game mechanics, but rewarding you for it greatly. And I think you know which one of these I prefer. Like and subscribe if you agree. Reinforced body is rather simple. Every character is supposed to have only 2 X-cost cards, one uncommon and one rare, and Tempest is a way cooler X-cost card, with it actually interacting with the core mechanic of the character. I think the card is fine, but one of the reasons X-cost cards exist is to give you an outlet for getting absurd amounts of energy, with most of them either dealing damage or giving you some kind of permanent resource. Reprogram got replaced with Pull Cap. While the reduced orb slots are most often considered a downside, there are definitely cases in which they are not, since you can evoke your orbs faster, working especially well with glass, for example. This makes the card more nuanced than just orb bad, non-orb good. I've always been a sucker for taking pre-existing mechanics in the game and playing around with them in order to make a completely unique card. I think having cards that heal you is, overall, bad for the game. This comes down to a single quote: given the chance, player will optimize fun out of the game. Unconditional healing causes very slow game plans. If you are able to play it just normally during your first cycle without taking any damage, then you would rather just play a power that helps you defend or helps you end the fight faster, with those kind of cards also actually interacting with the game. Unlike healing, which is almost never gonna do that. The other, more common use case for them is stalling out the fight, making the game more boring and monotonous. You might think that it's the same for fatal cards, but no, not really. The reason why they work is because, first of all, they can be used without the fatal effect, often dealing good damage, whereas healing cards have to be weaker than other defensive cards in order to be balanced. And also, because those encourage you to get the enemy to low health and end the fight with them. And while I would agree that they are still flawed, I think the satisfaction of getting lethal with them outweighs the bad parts about them. But okay, let's assume that cards with unconditional healing aren't bad for the game, as the elephant in the room, not yet, was added and still is in the game at the time of this recording. If that's the case, then you could argue that the Ironclad needs a card like that, because of the self-damage archetype, and also that self-repair encouraged way more min-maxing, as there were, and still are, many ways to replay powers in the Defect skip, for example with Amplify or Echoform, with the second example being especially bad, since with generative AI, you could just wait until you get it in order to get more healing, which is really boring but also technically the optimal play, assuming you have enough frost to block the enemy every turn. Static Discharge. Whenever you receive unblocked attack damage is such a weird line of text for a card in this game. Health is already a very valuable resource that you're meant to manage. Things like cheap damage, tanking for expensive powers, and damage racing are crucial parts of playing this game. So, having a card that kinda breaks that balance can cause a lot of problems. It's also very reliant on factors that well-designed cards really shouldn't rely on. It's completely useless and doesn't do anything if you're beating the fights flawlessly, basically punishing you for playing well. It also becomes worse the less HP you have to spend, so it kinda takes away from the most exhilarating part of the game, taking risks at very low HP. Cards like this make the game less dynamic and more static, pun intended, in terms of how much HP you're losing per fight, I think I should also mention, on the contrary, Femtanyl puzzle, rewarding you for losing HP, makes it a very well designed relic. There's a lot of stuff that relics can get away with, that cards can't, and vice versa. Amplify got reworked into Signal Boost. Having the card be not only this turn and exhausting is a great idea, since you don't have to rely on luck so much in order to draw it on the same turn that you draw one of your important powers. It also exhausts, which avoids the issue of it being useless after you have no more powers to play, in exchange for not having the potential of getting to replay multiple powers per fight, which I think is a fair trade-off, making the card overall better. Core Search gives you Artifact, and all artifact gain for the player got completely removed for a couple of reasons. First of all, there are many fights designed around applying a specific debuff to you, like the Queen, the Hunter Killer, etc. Even ignoring that, most of the fights in the game use at least one of the 3 common debuffs as a way to basically scale up and become more dangerous over time. So, a mechanic that just skips all that balancing and design is probably not healthy for the game. On top of that, you are able to do some really degenerate stuff with it, considering how temporary buffs work, or with the main balancing factor of certain cards being the debuff that they apply to you. Electrodynamics solved the issue of orbs not being able to deal AoE damage in the first game, but now, with the new addition of glass orbs, keeping the card would kinda muddle the key characteristics that orbs have, as it would make lightning outclass it in one of the main things it's supposed to be good at. I feel like Seek was always a rather problematic card. The ability to tutor up a specific card is a very powerful one, often limited and rare. This is because the game is balanced around consistency. You're not always able to get your essential powers in the first couple turns, and you're not always going to get the best defensive cards on the enemy's big attacks. This balance is broken by cards like Seek, since you're able to pick the best card from your deck for the given situation, or have way more consistency, playing your powers early, at literally no cost to yourself. Most importantly, it is a rare card on one of the characters, which makes the effect way too powerful for how often you see it. Secret Technique and Secret Weapon are both rare colorless cards, and also more limited than this one, and the Wish is an Act 3 Ancient buff, which are supposed to be insanely busted. On top of that, also giving you a downside. Thunderstrike basically just got transformed into Voltaic, rewarding you for channeling lightning in the form of even more lightning. The change from damage to lightning makes the card more synergistic with the many ways of the Defect interacting with orbs, but also itself, which gives it the ability to, very rarely, reach absurd numbers, creating unforgettable moments for the player, while still being a pretty bad card. And in my opinion, I think the game does have space for these kinds of ridiculous all-in cards. Now, finally, moving on to the last card, Fission. This card was just too good, especially upgraded. The ability to evoke all your orbs is a very powerful one, so being able to basically get an additional turn afterwards to rebuild all your evoked orbs made this card insanely broken, and also kinda boring, since there is almost no risk to playing the card. That's why I think Shatter is a way cooler version of the idea, making it feel like an insane burst of power coming from the orbs, at the cost of, as the name implies, shadowing everything you have built up to that point. And is it just me, or do you also feel like incredibly naked if the enemy somehow survives the burst? Like, it may be just my autism, but this just feels wrong. In a good way, of course, in a good way. With all that being said, where is my fake mic? With all that being said, thank you for watching until the end of the video, and thank you Riptide Lab for coming over as a guest on the channel. Make sure to check him out if you haven't already. Also, I have a Discord server now. Please join if you're interested, I am very active on there. All links should be in the description. For now, have a great rest of your day, and bye!